Hello, everyone, and welcome to Social Emotional Development in Adolescence, the very last lecture you will have to listen to me give online. Now, if you're wondering when adolescence really ends, I like to use this quote by Sarah Jane Blackmore. So, adolescence is defined as the period of life that starts with the biological, hormonal, physical changes of puberty and ends at the age at which an individual attains a stable, independent role in society. So you may ask yourself, am I really through adolescence yet? It may be no. Adolescence lasts into our early 20s, as we know. So some thought questions as you roll into this last module in order to relate to some of the abstract concepts in this chapter. Think a little bit about what your greatest concern was in middle school or high school, who the most influential people in your life were, how sure of yourself were you, how attached to school were you, because that's going to make some of this stuff, I think, more applicable, more relevant to you. The first thing I want to mention is the search for identity. This is one of Erik Erikson's crises, and what he believed was that the adolescent's most important developmental task was to devise a complex answer to the question, who am I? And so I think that's why you hear students in college often using the terms like, I found myself when, because there's a lot of experimentation that ought to go into the person who you think you are. So James Marsha took Erik Erikson's framework and subdivided it into different kinds of identity, either achievement or non-achievement of identity. And the gold standard of identity is what he calls identity achievement. That means that you have done a lot of healthy exploration in order to make decisions about your career path, your politics, your religion, your relationships, but you've really investigated all of those things. Identity foreclosure is a commitment to beliefs, to politics, without any exploration, without really looking at what anybody else believes. And that's actually pretty common in adolescence. Then there's identity diffusion, which is not committing to any specific identity, but not really exploring either. It's kind of a no man's land of, I don't know who I am or what I want. And moratorium is just a delay of making those decisions. I don't know what my politics are yet. I don't know if the religion I'm in now is the one I want to be in always. And moratorium is, I think, a pretty healthy place to be. It sounds like it's negative, but it's actually pretty healthy because you've decided that you can just delay that. You can do some thinking. And I think that one can last really quite a long time and be perfectly healthy. Now remember that self-concept is just the adjectives we assign to ourselves. So when we think about ourselves, what are some of the words that we use? Now, what's interesting about an adolescent self-concept is theirs is increasingly differentiated. That means they can see their strengths and limitations. They can sound contradictory. I'm terrible at math. I did great in class. And they also have a self-concept that is always pulling attention between what their self-concept is and what they think other people may think of them, which leads us to self-esteem. Self-esteem, remember, is the valuation of whatever that self-concept is. So if you're skinny, you would call yourself skinny and you value skinny, then that's going to be good for your self-esteem. If you're skinny and you're a boy, say, and you do not want to be skinny, that's going to be bad for your self-esteem. And in the transition to middle school and high school, self-esteem often takes a hit because we don't have the same teacher giving praise for things. There's more competition, greater emphasis on grades. And so self-esteem becomes a little bit less stable for a lot of students in middle and high school. Some of the things that go into self-concept and self-esteem are elements we've mentioned before, but I'll go into it again with a little bit more detail. Gender intensification is awareness of the expectations of gender. Remember that gender isn't your biological parts. It's your psychology. It's your feelings about, well, what a girl is like, what a girl should be like, what are the roles for girls if you happen to be female, and vice versa for boys. So boys actually rate themselves higher in appearance than girls do, and they generally have more positive self-concepts. Girls, however, rate themselves higher in social competencies. One way to think about gender identity and sexual orientation is to break them down into this particular graphic, in which California parents actually objected to. So if there are parents who object to abstinence-only programs, as I do, there are also parents who object to these kinds of images that I'm showing you now, which I think is actually helpful. So you'll have to make your own decisions about that. But if you're wondering what the difference between gender identity, gender expression, biological sex, and sexual orientation are, I think the gingerbread person is pretty helpful, because the identity is what's in your brain. It's your psychology. It's whether or not you feel male or female in your brain, or if you have a conflicted mixture of those things. Gender expression is what you look like, how you express yourselves, what you choose to wear, how you cut your hair. Biological sex is just your parts. And then there's also sexual orientation, which is, and notice interestingly about the gingerbread person, is these aren't one thing or the other. They are shown on a continuum for a reason, because lots of people are not one thing or another. There's a lot of times some real flexibility in terms of sexual orientation that is usually not mentioned in school. So if you have young people who may be attracted to both sexes, they might be very confused. So sexual orientation, who we're attracted to. These attractions begin really in middle childhood, around age 10, and about 5% to 13% of the population is homosexual. It's hard to say, because so many adolescents in particular are very much closeted about it, partly because they are unsure if they can trust their caregivers or parents to still accept them if they come out. But LGBTQ, the Q meaning queer, those youth are at an increased risk for suicide attempts, because it makes it very difficult to figure out and answer this question, who am I and how valuable am I? Ethnic identity is also huge when it comes to this equation of who I am. This isn't something we tack on to ourselves. It's felt deeply and all the way through us. It is us. And so race, because it's linked to power, is really quite important. And it's worth having conversations with students about this, especially if you teach something like English or social studies in which the topics emerge. One way I like to introduce this kind of this racial tension is a real issue nationally, personally, it is. And so there are great ways to talk to students about it. The images you're seeing on the right side of this slide are these terrific little YouTube videos that flip the script. Basically, it will say, what if Black people spoke to white people using the same sorts of terms or tropes? And when you flip the script, it's easier to see why that stuff is troubling. Minorities are considered minorities because of their relationship to power, because of the amount of choices they have relative to other people. So when you have students of a minority population, they're often grappling with their own identity in relationship to everyone else. So if you look at this slide, you can see that there's 4 different ways that students tend to adopt. One is assimilation, in which they find it easier to just identify with the majority culture and just roll along with that. One is marginal, which is they live in the majority culture, but they feel alienated by it, like they don't really belong. There's a separated identity, in which they've decided they are going to align with their own race and ethnicity and reject the majority. And then there's bicultural, which is that they are able to identify with both minority and majority cultures. And there's also an oppositional identity, which devalue the dominant group values. And that can happen when students become angry because they feel like their own cultural or racial heritage is being disregarded. So life in school. Positive school experiences promote healthy social development. It's that simple. Transitions to middle school and high school are especially hard for students of low socioeconomic backgrounds. It's hard enough to try to fit in when you can't afford like the cool clothes, when you pack a lunch that is barely a lunch. And schools are also more impersonal. Teachers are usually having to be a little bit tougher. And so sometimes relationships break down between students and teachers in schools. But school attachment is very important and highly, highly correlates with self-esteem, with motivation. Students who are not attached to school, who feel a detachment between themselves and what's going on at school, they tend to be more at risk for low self-esteem, delinquency, drugs, alcohol, and violent crimes. And then because of the hormones that are raging, they are often developing romantic relationships. And typically girls experience these earlier than boys, like as early as 12 or 13. Girls tend to focus on closeness and communication. Boys tend to focus on physical attraction. And there is a sexual double standard that is worth being aware of, where a boy, if he decides to become sexually active with several partners as a player, which actually has kind of positive connotations, but notice for the girl, that slut does not have the same positive sort of like connotations. Like a player is like, you kind of slap people on the back and say, congratulations. Girls, it's more shamey. It's worth being aware of the fact that language is not neutral. So there are a lot of things that are wonderful that are happening as identity develops. But because this is a difficult time and so much is changing, that mood imbalances can become more extreme. And factors that contribute to unhappiness are often low popularity, low self-esteem, and low academic success. A few more things I want to leave you with is the paradox of adolescence, which is that they are more talented, more physically able to do things, more resilient than they ever have been. And yet there is a crazy 200% increase in mortality rates. This has a lot to do with social displays, with peer pressure, with risky behavior, and with this feeling of being invulnerable. And so even though 80% of adolescents make it through this time in their lives with no major difficulties, there are great tragedies that are also befalling adolescents, many that have to do with driving, that have to do with substance abuse. Another problem that a lot of the adolescents you may work with are having is sexual assault. And many of those things can happen right in their own homes under the noses of their very own parents. Teens 16 to 19 are 3.5 times more likely than the general population to be victims of rape, attempted rape, or sexual assault, which is one of the reasons why having conversations about this is imperative. Like what constitutes sexual assault? constitutes consent? What is pressure? What is purview? When do you know somebody is not safe? Sometimes because of our uncomfortableness with topics of sexuality, we don't bring this stuff up. And so adolescents can be left to their own devices to try to figure out what to do about this. And one of the things I want to make sure that you bear in mind as you think about the kinds of trauma that results from sexual assault is that blaming the victim is participating in shame culture. That is, if you ever find yourself thinking, well, she had it coming because she was wearing X, Y, or Z, that is not helpful. And it's body shaming, it's clothes shaming, and it does not help people mend. Take a good hard look at yourself and ask, what is the most compassionate way I can be? One of the videos I'll leave with you today is Being 13, which looks at the impact of social media on teens. So much of building relationships or destroying relationships now happens on social media. So it's worth seeing. If you're going to teach middle school, I heartily urge you to watch at least a few minutes of this video. The next stage, according to Erickson, as you're leaving high school, as you're emerging into your adult lives, the great crisis or the great opportunity, according to Erickson, is to develop intimate relationships, connections with other people, either romantic or non-romantic, but you develop that ability to depend on each other and to be there for other people. So, as this is your last module, I am excited to see how you'll decide to answer the options that I give you for response. And I hope that you weather the rest of your adolescence with as little pain as possible, if indeed you're still an adolescent.